Hey, my ninjas, this guide will show you how to use the regular, the toxic, the paralytic, and the noxious ground fires. The ground fire reads, when set, these traps will explode when an enemy steps on them or after a set period of time has elapsed, with the toxic reading the same, with the addition that scattering poisonous powder over the surrounding area, the paralytic scattering neurotoxin powder, and the noxious reading scattering foul smelling pollutants over the surrounding area. These all effectively serve the same purpose, so I will be coupling them in the same video, with the differences being the ground fire having a jutsu cost of 1.6, the toxic and the paralytic having 1.3, and noxious having a 1.0. The total amount preparable for all of these being at a 6, and of course, the status ailment that all of these inflict, the ground fire inflicting scorch, toxic inflicting poison, paralytic inflicting paralysis, and noxious inflicting stench. Since stench is a less well known ailment, the status reads the effectiveness of medicine is decreased and you are more vulnerable to enemy strikes. All of these jutsu are on the slower side of the medium casting animations and are placed immediately in front of the player at their feet. All of these can be used when the player is out of key. However, due to the slow casting animation, this is not a recommended way to use these. If the jutsu's designated color does not show up on the ground and the player is interrupted, the jutsu will not go into effect, even if the player's hand has actually made contact with the ground. Thus, these are not best used mid fight. Individually, these jutsu are the much stronger versions of their shuriken and powder counterparts, and are primarily for inflicting their specific ailments on enemies that have high resistance that the shuriken or powder jutsus would not suffice. And preemptively layering ground fire jutsu that can secure multiple inflictions without the risk of missing with projectiles or the time that it would take to cast between each projectile jutsu. However, even if the player does not move around, simply casting the jutsu will not lay all of them in the same spot, and they will be slightly staggered. The maximum I was able to lay before their timer expired was 21. The preferred order to maximize all of them are the ground fire, as this will allow human enemies to fall down on their back and become exposed to the other ground fire's lingering effects. These are the only ground fire that knock enemies off their feet. Then the paralytic ground fire, as the paralysis takes a second to kick in, allowing enemies to trip the regular ground fire. The noxious ground fire, as this is best maximized from the consistent exposure that deal as much key damage as possible. And then the toxic ground fire, as the poison inflicts fast and lasts the longest and is the only one that does not really need any assistance from the others. However, this is circumvented by holding the block button and slightly moving back and to the right, as this allows the player to effectively place them all in the same exact position. While these are intended to be individual target based, they do have a lingering effect that can affect multiple targets if they are caught in the blast radius. However, the lingering effect does not last as long as its powder counterparts. Regardless of the player's positioning and the direction of the enemy, or how long ago the ground fire was set, if the enemy triggers the ground fire, it will aggro them to the player's position, regardless of stealth. If ground fire is laid directly on an opponent, it will trigger the heavy knockback. The paralytic ground fire can trigger and be used to engender the paralysis loop on yokai. The noxious ground fire is the only jutsu that grants players access to the stench ailment and are not to be underestimated. Despite all the other ground fire primarily for the purposes of inflicting a corresponding ailment, while these do inflict stench, they much more importantly inflict a insignificant amount of key damage against opponents.